Good morning to the audience of Growth Brands and More. We have a super interesting episode today with a very interesting and experienced guest. Welcome, Artian. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
So, you have a super interesting experience in fast moving consumer goods, especially in food, Unilever, Friesland Campina, and then you moved out of the food manufacturing, but you still touch on food with the health related approach. Can you tell us a bit more about how you developed your career?
I was blessed to start my career at the founding company of Unilever, Vandenberg and Jurgens, which was the world's capital of margarine and oils and fats. I learned a lot there in terms of how consumers live their lives, and also that at the end of the day, market share is a function of penetration times frequency times usage intensity. I learned that from Leo Verkleij, who was at the market research department as an assistant product manager. And some of these learnings I took throughout my career. So I moved on. I quickly moved to the ranks. I worked for Unilever both in Singapore and in China. In China, I was the head of the tea division in Asia Pacific. And then I moved to a joint venture of the Coca-Cola company and Nestle, which was actually also very interesting because having experienced the power of distribution at the Coke side is a wonderful experience. And that joint venture ceased to exist. So then I moved to Friesland Campina, where I stayed for another 7 years. And in my last role, I was a corporate chief marketing officer and responsible for all consumer brands worldwide in Friesland Campina. That was a first interesting move. I developed for Friesland Campina a nutrition policy that basically was a guideline of how to develop the portfolio in terms of health, in terms of nutrition, and making a distinction between products that you use daily and products that you use occasionally. And the aim of Friesland Campina was to increase the percentage of health products sold. That was in 2015. Then I left the foods FMCG world, and I lead a startup into a scale-up that was called fitchannel.com, which was an online platform about fitness and nutrition. And there I learned that consumers or users want to do something about their health. They start with doing sports, but they want to lose weight. And losing weight, you do not do on the sports mat, you do in the kitchen. And I also learned that only by keeping people in the rhythm of eating better and moving more, we were able to help them to lose weight. Now, coming back to the first formula that I learned at Friesland Campina, at Unilever, interestingly, food companies measure whether consumers come back, so whether you have repeat sales, but rarely measure what repeated coming back does to the consumer. And I learned that health, at the end of the day, is more driven by frequency and usage intensity than it is driven by penetration. So in the health world, we make a lot of fuss about how unhealthy some products are, which they are, but if you eat them occasionally, it doesn't matter. What matters more is a moderately healthy product that has a high frequency and a high usage intensity that's getting into a repertoire, a weekly repertoire, and is consumed almost on a weekly basis, monthly basis, and that for years. That has a much bigger health impact than the occasional usage. So I learned in the fast moving world to understand consumer behavior and to get an interest of what I call the banal side of life, because that's where the magic is. How do people integrate products into their lives? How do they use them? How do they use them often? And how do they use them in large quantities? It has a lot to do with repertoire.
Are there specific blind spots the CMO of a food company learned running a consumer health platform?
I think the blinds. So if you go back to the Ehrenberg Bass Institute or How Brands Grow, that is famous for growing brands, basically they say it doesn't matter, focus on penetration. And that's what you see a lot of CMOs doing. They work on penetration, they work on reach, they work on trying to reach as many people as possible. But they don't realize that the health harm is being caused by frequency and usage intensity. I think that is a blind spot.
Yeah, that indeed frequency and repeat might not be a growth driver as big as penetration, but it actually has a much bigger impact, especially food and beverages, on the consumer side, which is the category usage frequency, speaking in marketing research terms.
Correct.
Then that's an interesting one. What are you doing now as focusing on this health equation?
I helped to sell, as a CEO, I sold fitchannel.com to new investors. And now I'm running my own consulting, basically translating my marketing knowledge into public health and trying to understand what drives health. In the health world, they talk a lot about making a healthy option more accessible. But I think we should make the convenient option more healthy. What is that we still rely a lot on individual choices of people, and we think that people are rational and make rational choices, and that if we inform them properly, that they will make the right choice. The reality is that it is not the case. So what I realize more and more is that repeated behavior is basically carried by what I call rhythm carriers. So these are daily context where human behavior is being created. And that's a family, that's a school, that's a workplace, that's a sport club, can be the church, can be the neighborhood, the community center. And the type of behavior that is normalized, standardized, and facilitated in repeated terms, that has a lot of impact on how we live our lives. And also, if that behavior is unhealthy, how unhealthy we become.
And the reason I invited and we decided to do this episode, it's actually interesting because we had a conversation online about how this health risk, which you are describing from the standpoint of the consumer, it's actually going back and becoming a business risk for companies.
Yes.
Just as like sustainability is now a risk for companies.
Correct.
We had this conversation where I was explaining to you or someone else on the podcast recently that when I came to Poland 15 years ago, there were like 5, 6 wine producing companies. There is 800 wineries now. And part of that, it's because climate change.
Yes.
And wine producing business is moving north because in traditional places like Italy, France, Spain, the drought and the conditions for growing wine so massively are changing. They are too harsh now. So that's also the risk of lack of sustainability and environmental care. So
Yes.
can you tell us a little bit more about this risk and how this risk is transferring from a personal consumer health to becoming a risk for companies?
So what you see basically three trends. increasingly we realize that if we do not eat and drink healthy, we become ill. Chronic illness, the prevalence of chronic illness like obesity, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer, is prevailing at earlier and earlier ages. Diabetes was an elderly illness 100 years ago. Today, many people have diabetes. And so the first trend is that consumers are increasingly becoming aware of that and are looking for products that drive health outcome. The nutritional science and the nutritional discourse has focused a lot on what is in the product. We focused on sugar, we focused on fats, we focused on protein, now we focus on fiber maxing. But increasingly, the consumer is moving towards, but what does this product do to my body? And they're focusing on the outcome, what the outcome is. And these outcomes are satiety, energy, glycemic load, metabolic impact, microbiome. So these are the big trends. So the big health trends are trends where people are looking for, what does this product do to my body? That's one level. The second level is that nutritional science is also moving on. And that is, they are moving from, okay, we need to produce as many calories for the least amount of money. That's how we started after the war, the Second World War. Towards, we need to produce safe products. So that created the erection of the E numbers and all the additives that needed to be safe. Then there was a functional food development in nutrition. So we thought that food could do the same thing as pills. I introduced Basal Proactive in the Netherlands, but we learned that's not the case. And that has to do with consumer behavior. And then now we move to outcome driven nutrition. So also nutritional science is moving to, what do these products in the repertoire do to the health and the fitness of people? So that's the second point. The third point is regulation, because the cost of unhealthiness and the cost of chronic disease are a societal burden. Governments are struggling with ballooning healthcare costs. 70% of these healthcare costs are coming because of the growth of chronic disease. And 70% of the causality of that is because of metabolic dysfunction, which is, what do we eat and how do we metabolize our food? So at some point in time, governments, and that already, for instance, in the UK, will turn to producers of food and say, hello, you put too much sugar in your products. I don't want you to advertise these products to kids. I want you to start basically registering what type of food are you selling and how healthy is that. So you see that these three trends are coming together, and that will make it a board issue. Because then it has to do, the board level question is, how exposed is our portfolio to these trends? And what can we do to minimize the risk? But also, what can we do to grow? Because this is also a growth trend. What can we do to proactively drive products that in large quantities and in high frequency can drive health gains?
In fact, you wrote a recent article that there is a parallel with the ESG, again, because first is responsibility, then reputation, then regulation, and then there is a portfolio risk because demand is shifting, and then you as a company are not ready for the demand shift. So based on what you're observing or the companies you're working with and the countries or the health regulators you're working with, on which part of the curve are most companies? What are we observing?
I think we're at the beginning of this. But the health revolution or the health development as an ESG issue will go faster than the carbon one. And they are related, by the way, because if you connect them to regenerative agriculture, they are related. So I think we're at the beginning of this. The issue with the health development is that it's not one number. Carbon is an emission, and what do companies emit? Health is a bit more difficult. It's at multiple levels, but the impact will be the same. And companies, I think, will need to start looking at their portfolio and trying to understand what role do these products have in people's life. Not whether they buy them and come back to buy them, but are our products actually indeed consumed at very high frequency and large quantities, and what health consequence does that have?
So we agree that carbon, in a certain way, forced the restructuring of portfolios. Okay, and because it was one measure, not perfect, but one measure, it was easier. In this case, from a nutrition point of view, as you just said, there isn't one measure. So what's the framework? How can I help one my food clients improving and making sure that their portfolio is adapted? Because we're going to be talking about GLP-1 in a second, but there is a lot of fanciness now about GLP-1 because companies see demand shifting. But to be honest with you, most of the responses are stupid, which is, oh, we have a GLP-1 fittings label certified product, which as a GLP-1 user, by the way, and let's be completely honest, because I am one of the guys who's got the problem here. As a GLP-1 user, I look at this as I really don't want that product. I don't want it without a label. And now that you stamp it's GLP approved, I still don't want it because that's not what the medicines I'm taking is. And that's a simple insight. So really, a lot of this isn't working in terms of response. So what's the framework and what kind of responses would you wish for and what you're working with?
Yeah. So what I keep telling to companies is we are moving from ingredient accountability to impact accountability. And so companies are increasingly held accountable for ingredients. The sugar tax is a way to help keep companies accountable. We are moving towards health outcomes. So what I think the framework is, you can start already optimizing your portfolio by looking at the ingredients, and then the usual suspects are fat, sugar, hydrates, etc., and proteins. But I think the framework should be that, and I think science will help us with that, we need to get to outcome-driven measurements. And with big data, because increasingly consumers are using wearables, they're using continuous glucose monitoring at mass scale. So increasingly we get at population level data that we can even see what the correlation is between certain repertoires of consumption and certain health outcomes. And supermarkets will also play an important role here because they have the data at the consumer level. They can see on a weekly basis what people put into their baskets. And if that comes together, the framework will move from we look at ingredients to we develop for outcomes. And that doesn't mean that you cannot have a product that's indulgent, but it does mean that you market that not in a way that you want to sell as much as possible of it to one consumer. You probably will also guide them to use that in a way that fits the health character of that product. And for a healthy product that you can fit into the daily consumption or in the weekly repertoire of families, you will make sure that will get a higher scrutiny. So you get a portfolio investment where on one hand you ask, what role does this product play in people's lives? Is it a daily product or is it an occasional product? And depending on that character, you will start developing for health outcomes.
But you keep going back to the notion of repertoire, which I think it's critical. But the repertoire also applies to a higher level of degree. If I am the brand manager responsible for Mayo in the Netherlands, I don't have that point of view of the repertoire that the country manager for food Unilever in the Netherlands has. So how do you balance? Because you need to sell that concept to both the top guys, but also to the operators at brand management level or key account managers. So how do you explain it to them, the concept of repertoire?
Yeah, this is probably the strategic question because this counts not only for people in the companies, but even for public health officials. If you look at the food pyramids, these are ingredient pyramids. And people don't ingredients, they eat meals. And they eat meals in a very selective way. So most people that cook for a family can cook 5 or 6 recipes out of their head. So by and large, families eat on a weekly basis more or less the same every week. And then the question becomes, if that weekly repertoire is healthy, you stay healthy. If that weekly repertoire is unhealthy, you become sick. That's as simple as it is, because this weekly repertoire is consumed over weeks, months, for years.
Yeah.
And health is not an immediate thing, it is something that builds up over time. So I think marketeers need to understand what their role plays in the repertoire of people. So take, for instance, pizza, the deep frozen pizza. If you drive pizza as an occasion, Friday night, pizza night, you consciously push away a potentially healthy meal for a pizza meal. Now, you can do that, and I think the big pizza companies are doing that, but with that comes a responsibility. And if you push pizza to a weekly occasion, you need to ask yourself the question, is it okay that I push thousands and thousands of families to a more unhealthy diet? And I think that comes with the obligation to say, okay, we push Friday night pizza night, but we make sure that this pizza is not doing health harm. And that can be done. So by understanding how your products fits into a repertoire, by understanding what the impact of that product is in the repertoire, because there is an, how do you call it, crowding out effect. And so if the unhealthy product crowds out a healthy product, the repertoire as a whole becomes less healthy. And we need to get a better understanding of that. But also at the public health level, they should start promoting repertoires. How does a healthy repertoire look like? What type of meals should I eat to eat in a healthy during the week? And not in terms of ingredients and food groups, because people cannot do the math.
And here comes, I think, the role supermarkets play.
Yes.
Because, especially with the digitalization, the consideration set is now becoming actually a list, a consideration list, in the sense that I do most of my shopping for big items online, and we buy a lot of the greens to the shops where we go and check the greens ourselves, but for the rest, we do it online. And when I do shopping online, I do it on the basis of what I've purchased, my existing list. So that builds the repertoire you're talking
Your
about,
repertoire.
basically. Yeah,
Yes.
that builds the repertoire we're talking about, which makes the role of the supermarket critical. Now, what we have seen in the past years it's the supermarket for commercial and communication purposes. They have developed recipe magazines, promotional items, and so on and so forth. So, do you think they are actually driving because they do a lot of education? It's also education that they do because they get money from producers to promote the usage of certain products or explain. Do you think that their role should be changing? Because they're talking about ingredients, as long as ingredients, it's what they sell. If it's Friday night, pizza night, then it's not an ingredient, it's the item which they're selling. So, how do you explain this and how would you envision the role to change?
I think the role of the supermarket has increased many times over the past 20, 30 years. When I started to work at Unilever in the 90s, we told Albert Heijn what to put on the shelf. Now it's the other way around. So the power balance has shifted. The second thing is that, and that's what people forget, supermarkets are not only assortment managers, they are producers at the same time. 60% of the calories that consumers in Western Europe consume are produced by supermarkets, not by food manufacturers. So we focus a lot of our attention on food manufacturers, but supermarkets have a much bigger role in directing the repertoires of families because they decide what they put on sale and they already know now what we are going to eat in week 48. If Albert Heijn puts a certain dish on promotion, a large part of Holland will eat that dish in that week. So they have a much bigger impact on the repertoire than individual food companies. So, conclusion is yes, I agree with you. Supermarkets have a bigger role. They also will start facing the same pressure of the three big trends that I alluded to at the beginning of the conversation. And also, regulators are increasingly starting to look at supermarkets. In Holland, they are now publicly publishing the amount of kilos they sell that are part of the food pyramid of the Netherlands. On average, that's 40%. And so they do that by themselves. But at some point in time, the government will start saying, okay, now we're going to put a target on it. And they want to increase that target because it's in the interest of the public to have a larger share of the assortment sold as part of what is publicly seen as healthy food.
Because the true balance, on one end, which is going back to what you started at the beginning, on one end, food needs to be affordable. So government want larger supermarkets because scale drives affordability to a certain sense. But on what the cost of affordability right now, it's exactly junk food between quote unquote, or the wrong repertoire to quote you more directly, which then has a cost from a healthcare point of view and an impact and an effect on the healthcare. So that needs to be balanced out at a certain point.
But what will happen if supermarkets start to, because they are the biggest calorie directors of the world. They're calorie directors. And if they start deciding to push that healthy repertoire, volumes in that healthy repertoire will go. So the cost of those healthy foods will go down. And so take biological food in the Netherlands. Costs are very high at the moment, but the volumes are very low. If supermarkets starts pushing that, volumes will go up. If volumes go up, cost will go down. So at the end of the day, economics work.
So it's willingness what is missing in the equation or incentive.
Yeah, I think it is vision. The paradigm was we are not taking the outcome of food into account. We only focus on what's in the food. And that paradigm is shifting. And you already alluded to GLP-1, but that's only exacerbating that. Because GLP-1s basically make manifest that food does something to your body. And I think that paradigm shift will also start to impact portfolio allocations. It will start to impact assortment decisions of supermarkets. It starts to impact promotion, advertising bans. So you see that already happening, that some cities are banning the advertising for unhealthy food. It's coming. And it's unlike in the carbon footprint area, it's not one number. I call it, it's a death by 1,000 cuts. It is a couple of elements together that will start making the change. And that change is closer to us than we currently think. It's coming fast.
I think it's important because this kind of change, it's usually accelerated. There is a catalyst, which is one of the players in the ecosystem. It could be the manufacturers, it could be the retailers, it could be the regulator, it could be the. We've seen this with tobacco products, no?
Yes.
But at the end of the day, because it is an ecosystem and it's a very complex system, everyone needs to move in a certain direction. You don't reach a tipping point because there is one guy screaming at the world, no? Whole
No.
system. So based on that, who's more behind? Is the producers, is the retailers, is the government, and who's got the highest incentive at this point?
Yeah, incentive depends a little bit how you look at it. If I was owning a company, a food company, I would ask myself the question, is the portfolio that I sell still up to standard 10 years from now? And if that portfolio is inherently unhealthy, I would say, no, I need to shift that portfolio. I need to start to divest in certain categories that are so unhealthy that I cannot keep that. And I need to make the rest of the portfolio, I need to improve it. And I need to understand what my food portfolio does in the body of people over time, because then that's driving health. Retailers implicitly have the same challenge because they are also producers. And so they always say that they are only deciding on the assortment, but they are also producers and they produce most food products, especially the fresh food products, they produce themselves. So retailers can also turn this into a huge opportunity. And the first retailer that really start driving the positive health outcome will start to gain traction. Regulators are also, so it is coming together and a few, so that's why this, you called it a health risk or a health, how did we call it again?
A corporate
Uh,
risk.
Yeah, it becomes a corporate risk because a few of these developments come together. If consumers increasingly want more health, but they don't, why are people not doing it? Because the repertoires, the behavior context they are in are pushing them away. So we need to start changing these contexts.
But let me then play the devil's advocate for a second, because if I look then at P penetration as one, we have seen that whole food and the whole natural channel has developed, but it's not really profitable and it's still, it's big, huge, but it's a niche. It's barely scratching the surface. It's 5% of the number of stores, basically, of the whole US universe. You have now, with the recent presidency, the MHA movement, Make American Health Again. Besides the politics of it, there is at least conversation and the implications of it, and discussions about unhealthy ingredients in that sense. But do you think that's the direction? Because it seems to me that sometimes they do progress and then they stop and go back.
Yeah. So let me approach this from two angles. First of all, you mentioned the MAHA movement and Make America Healthy Again. The MAHA months are a driving force. And of course, you can say it's a bit playing for the Bühne, but the decision to start forbidding the artificial food dyes, it's a first sign. The other thing that you see is that the cost of chronic disease are also impacting labor productivity, sick leave, and the fact that people are out of labor because they cannot do the labor anymore. Increasingly, health becomes a production factor.
Yeah, it's the lack of productivity. Very true.
People that have a chronic disease are often ill more often, but also they're getting out of work because they can't work anymore, and that needs to be paid. And it needs to be paid by the employer. So what you see now, I think my expectation is that employers also start to realize I need to keep my employers healthy. In Holland, there is a guy who started legal proceedings against the government because his logic was if you force me to buy shoes with iron tips to protect the toes of my workers, I also want to protect my workers with a healthy lunch. And he didn't want to pay the fiscal tax that was related to it. He won at the highest court levels in Holland. The Dutch government changed the law, so he will go again. But that's a sign. So at some point in time, you see these things coming together because chronic disease is becoming too impactful in society. If you have a young boy of 60 years old that has already obesity, he's basically unable to be productive for the rest of his life. And that starts impacting. So it's coming. The question is how fast it will come.
Yeah, makes sense. Which it's a great opening to discuss GLP-1.
Yes.
What's your take on
Well,
GLP-1?
let me first start with obesity is an illness. It's not the same as being overweight. You can be overweight and not ill. But if you are obese, most of the time you're also ill. So I think to treat that illness with medication makes a ton of sense. What you see now is that people are also using that product because they're overweight. The question is that the right thing to do? We don't know because we don't know the long-term effect of this medication yet. The other side effect of the consumption of this medication in America, 14% of the population is using GLP-1s. It has tremendous impact on food volume. And food volume is going down. And in some categories faster than others. And these happen to be the unhealthy categories and the snack categories, the craving categories. And that's the interesting part of this medicine. So I think it does two things. It realizes, I think we start to realize that the biological impact of this is huge. It has also impact on behavior. Whether it has lasting impact on behavior, we don't know yet. The early signs is that if you stop using the medicine, you go back. And if you have not changed your lifestyle, you will go back to the old weight because your lifestyle is carrying, it's also a rhythm carrier, is carrying your weight. So, yeah, I'm in one hand, quite happy with GLP-1s because it shakes up, it wakes people up.
And I think what it does, it actually, in a way, it changes the repertoire for everybody in the family. At least that's my experience here, because we cook differently. We order less from outside.
Yes.
And regardless, that's also a bit of a problem. But at the end of the day, I think we know on one end the long-term effect, because the medicine, the drug exists for 25 years. But it was used for a different ailment. But indeed, we need to understand more. But to me, it seems that a lot of companies really don't understand the depth of the change,
Yes.
and they're trying to survive and say, okay, we're for them, it's just another TikTok trend that they're gonna follow and try tap on. So how do we explain to food companies the demand is shifting, and what they can do and should be doing with regards to GLP-1?
I would like to echo the first part of your comment. If one person in the family is on GLP-1, the whole family starts to eat differently. What does that mean? It means that food consumption is a social construct. And we think that in many ways and forms, I sometimes believe we put the individual at too high a level. We are less individualistic than we think we are. So your example, I think, is exactly right. You see it also when one family member is turning vegetarian. All of a sudden, the whole family starts to eat less meat. So I think what the implication of this is that companies need to understand the social interaction of behavior, food behavior, and food consumption. They need to understand the impact on repertoire, because this is also a crowding out effect. If you are on GLP-1s and therefore you eat certain foods less, these foods crowd out other foods. So that's one part. The other part is that if you look at the individual level, you get to the notion that we need to put more nutrition in less calories. So the nutrition density needs to go up, because if you eat less calories, you still need the nutrients. So the opportunity is in, and you see already companies jumping on that. They say, okay, we make products that have a higher calorie density, of a higher nutrition density, which I think is interesting. And that's a prelude to outcome driven nutrition, because the next step is that if you put more nutrition in the products, you also want to understand what these products do to the health in the body of people. And I think the notion of the GLP-1 is the focus of the biological processes in our body with regard to food metabolism. So if you start at that end, you will get many ideas for innovation and growth.
How do I sell those concepts to the board? Because the board is the one who's more deaf about this change.
Yeah, I always say we need to help the boards to look outside, open the windows, become part of society and speak with people, because it's around you. You have used GLP-1s, you are an expert. I know also a few people, everybody knows a few people who are on GLP-1. And if you talk to the people and the impact it has, you start to understand how you can adjust your marketing, your portfolio, your innovation, your product development, and your communication. At the end of the day, it starts by understanding the consumer. And the consumer is changing because of these medications. That's clear.
And funny, reminds me when I joined Procter and Gamble nearly 30 years ago now. Uh, as a junior, one thing that I always found funny is the fact that once in a while they would take all the presidents of the companies and they would bring them shopping in the supermarket because from there it's difficult to keep the reality of what actually happens in store. Truly happens in store because of course we all done these trade visits which are basically theater where you see all these fantastic totems of your products and the life, and then you get out of the shop and the totem gets removed because it's just for the visit basically. But yeah, I think
But
that's a great insight. Yes.
I worked at two companies where this was policy. At Coke, all board meetings we had started with a trade visit. All of them. This was not a staged visit. You went with a sales guy, you got a card, and you had to check the facings in the coolers of the different Coca-Cola products. And it was also reviewed with the sales team. Every board meeting, every strategic meeting we had started with that. Another example is Hindustan Lever. As an assistant product manager, you were only allowed to open your mouth in a meeting when you had 60 home visits with consumers behind your belt. And that's the way you learn.
Yeah, makes sense. If we were to forecast, just to close on GLP-1, assuming that GLP-1 it's going to grow even in Europe, what do you expect? Which categories do you expect are going to be the big losers, and which categories would you urge companies to bet on?
I think the losers are the categories where craving is a big driver for consumption because the cravings go down. I also think, interestingly, I read a scientific paper the other day that with GLP-1, your sense for sugar and salt goes up. So all of a sudden you find it's a bit like drinking tea without sugar for the first time. And then after you've done it many times, starting to drink tea with sugar again, you find the tea way too sweet. Apparently that is also happening. So also sweet and salt categories might see there. So it might also have a positive effect that if many people are on these medications, we need to bring down the sweetness and the saltiness of our products. The other thing that I think is that the companies of the categories that will gain are the real food categories, and that's the good news. And so people start to want to eat real food again. And I think the growth opportunity is to make real food convenient. And so you see a lot of these health organizations, they say, yeah, we should start cooking again and very complicated recipes, but I'm not sure whether that will happen. And so that's why my mantra is make the convenient option more healthy, not make the healthy option more convenient. So I believe that people will keep looking for convenience, but they just want another outcome. They want a healthier outcome. So the food companies that sell convenience food with a healthy outcome, they will start winning.
And on that note, you have been arguing that companies should actually have a chief health officer, food companies.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit what you mean and what you envision?
We had that conversation also in the context of ESG and with the carbon, that the ESG move has created a sustainability officer in the board of companies. The interesting thing with health is that it is also dispersed in many parts of the company. It's partly owned by R&D, it's partly owned by marketing, it's partly owned by legal, it's partly owned by regulatory people. But I think health becomes such an important driver for food companies that needs to be heard at board level. And it needs to be somebody, and whether that's called a health officer or whether you make somebody responsible, but somebody should own the health question, the health board level issues at board level and be able to influence decision making on it. I expect that in 10 years' time, companies should be able to stand up and say, look, we produce food products that people consume in high frequency and large quantities, but we know for sure that we are not driving health harm. That's where we're going to. So the accountability will be flipped. The accountability is not anymore, we ensure that we have safe products. The accountability will become, we ensure that our products don't do health harm. And in order for that to happen, health becomes a board level issue, and therefore it needs board level representation.
What would be a credible health impact dashboard that this role would use with the board and the company?
Would it be?
What is a credible health dashboard? What KPIs should they look into? At the end of the day, when you are at the top, you need to track numbers. And
Yes.
we said this isn't the Carpen story of ESG and sustainability. There isn't one number. Fine. But then what are the numbers that they should look at?
I think it starts with understanding the health impact of your portfolio. So they should track the percentage of daily products versus occasional products. They should track that daily products have more health scrutiny than occasional products. They should track the health outcomes of their products. So we need different measurements for health outcomes. We probably also need a different type of company like Nielsen, or market research will also start to change. So there's these type of numbers that they need to track.
So it's really looking at their portfolios and what they supply from a nutrition point of view.
Yeah. Nutrition and outcome.
Which basically starts with what the outcomes are, no? A shared definition of what the outcomes are. And does that definition exist already?
And there's also discussion about ultra processed foods. A definition was proposed by South American scientists. And now that this discussion is also being discussed. The definition is not there yet. And indeed, the definition needs to come. At least we need to have alignment about what health outcome is. But going back to the framework for companies, it's all about its portfolio metrics. I think that's important. Minimum nutritional standards, but also evidence standards for claims. Marketing principles will also become part of the equation. Repertoire understanding. So boards should understand what the role of their product is in the repertoire of people, because that is so important for health outcomes. Take the Coca-Cola company. They have a framework called OBPPC, and they try to make the product part of as many occasions as possible. The question is, given the discussion we had, can that hold in the future? Or should they say, this part of the Coke portfolio, you should eat or drink with more moderation and enjoy it. And this part of the portfolio is more for daily consumption. So The total beverage company is a concept that can be used the right way, but also the wrong way.
Yeah, makes sense. So, closing reflections. What is that the one thing that the board should look into during their next portfolio review?
I think they should ask themselves the question, if our portfolio is consumed in large quantities and high frequency, what is the health outcome of our portfolio consumption? That's the only question they should ask themselves.
And what are the likely answers and actions?
I think for some companies, these portfolios are not looking good. For some, if you are a vegetable company, you are quite okay. The likely actions will be that they need to start to distinguish indeed what is occasional, what's daily. Then they should start to decide how can we get more insight and understanding of how our products perform in the portfolio, in the repertoires, the weekly repertoires of families and consumers. What is the health or unhealth contribution that we create, and what can we do about it?
Terrific. What is the core assumption, the current core assumption about health and growth, which is wrong and needs to change? Growth from a corporate point of view.
Growth from a corporate point of view, that's now we get to the beginning of the conversation, is driven by penetration times frequency times usage intensity. That's growth. I think what we realize now is that health harm is driven by frequency and usage intensity. That's the paradox. And society, and because the externalities of this growth mantra will drive change.
But you also said that health it's not the enemy of growth.
No.
Okay.
Health, I think, is the next growth operating system. The companies that will adopt this new operating system the fastest will win. So some companies will not win. If you keep selling unhealthy foods, at some point in time, you will not win anymore.
Is this a bit the evolution that we have seen with the introduction of cars, where basically the companies that were doing work with horses and coaches and didn't adapt, and those that readapted their business model, like Hermes, by the way, before 300 years? Is that
Yes.
how we could describe? It's almost like technological change, which is not technology driven.
Yes. That's probably the right way to summarize it. I expect that, and you see it already because you see already big companies making portfolio changes and divestments of parts of the portfolio. And of course, they will never use health as a reason why they do that. But at the end of the day, investment decisions are the culmination of multiple risk factors. So some way, somehow, the management boards feel that holding an unhealthy portfolio exposes them into the future. And that's why they move.
And the way they justify is our growth potential is limited. How they
Yes.
sell it. Our growth,
Yes.
of course, the growth potential of the current portfolio is limited, not
Yes.
of the industry.
No. We
Yeah.
always need to eat.
Better, but we still need to. It was really a great conversation, and I really enjoyed and I learned a lot. So I want to thank you for that, Artian. Uh, one final thought from your side?
I would say health is not the enemy of FMCG growth. Health is the next growth operating system.
And with that note, I want to thank you again and come back when you think that there is more to discuss about this. I love it. And I think
I'll keep you
my
posted.
audience will really love it. So thank you, and I'll see you soon.
Bye bye.
Thank you.